The power-ups were wearing off and the constant trolling was starting to get to me. They couldn't outwit me, so they were stooping to lower tactics. I hadn't anticipated that. I was getting huge amounts of hate mail with badly spelled insults. I was getting tired of giving the same explanations over and over to people who refused to believe them. My web host dropped me and I had to move my site. Some guy in Thailand was sending me literally millions of spam hate mails that said simply, "Fuck you, faggot." That ruined my inbox. I switched to Google Apps with Gmail to fix the problem, which ended up being way better anyhow. The DSi, obviously inspired by the iPhone, was to be officially announced at GDC, which my Meta protest campaign viral ad ended on. I had assumed that they would announce an open game store. I was wrong. The rumors came out that it was to be as closed as ever. What was the point? I emailed my impromptu mailing list again, sighing they had a chance to catch up to the iPhone. They could have quickly announced an open platform. I knew they wouldn't do it. They dropped the ball. I was upset. They had completely left me hanging. Well, it was my own fault. I had never really respected Nintendo of America much, knowing that they were mostly business and marketing and didn't actually make any games there. It was just people doing the job. Most of them probably didn't care what they sold. Most likely, nobody there even had the authority to approve what I was doing. It didn't matter that they didn't reply. It didn't matter that it didn't work. What mattered was that everything I predicted eventually came true. I could see the future, but I didn't yet understand or believe. A young Steve Jobs had been obsessed with IBM not caring about the home computer market. I got obsessed with Nintendo not caring about independent developers. What was the next generation of game developers going to do? It was obvious. They would all jump on the iPhone. I went and bought a PSP, my first non-Nintendo video game device. I spent a few days navigating the tumbleweed disaster maze of PSP hacking instructions and installed custom firmware by cutting a wire on the battery. I played Final Fantasy VII for the first time, hated it, and considered being the first to live stream playing through all Final Fantasies in a row lying in bed with a monitor installed over my face. I was tired and I had to focus. I had to get back to development and port my game, since it was never going to happen on a Nintendo system and I had no other choice but to keep moving forward. I had threatened to release my own flashcard with my game on it, but there was no point without the SDK. I would never have the passion for continuing development. Some of my fans had started a forum. I didn't want a forum, but now it was there, and I made it part of the site. It was fun to play around with, but it went against what I was trying to do. I really was not ready to release a demo, but more and more people were demanding it. Pressured by my fans and against my own wishes, I ordered a variety of flashcards, and when they arrived I spent a few days trying to make what I had work on all of them. The first demo I released was fairly buggy, and I ended up having to pull an all-nighter replacing the sound system to get it to work. I have no idea how many people downloaded it. My 5 years of painstaking work to make a retail-quality game had been officially rejected and delegated as homebrew. I didn't want to create the indie scene. I didn't consider myself homebrew. I was trying to make a retail product with an official SDK. The protest officially ended on the first day of GDC. 100 days exactly. I had wrongly assumed that Nintendo was going to announce an app store for the DSi there. After registering, the staff had a security guy grab me and take me to a conference room, where the heads of GDC sat around a table and they interviewed me. There were probably people from Nintendo there too. I answered the questions honestly, and they seemed to like me. I told them I was just doing something unique, that I had invented the first real-time internet soap opera protest, and I was just running it like an improv TV show, adding something interesting and crazy each day. Suddenly a police officer showed up and asked if he could search my bag just in case I had a katana or something in there. And I let him. I had nothing, of course. Afterwards I wondered if he was actually a real officer. Not that it would have mattered. The director lady of the conference asked, "What will you do if your dreams don't come true?" I thought about it for a half a second and said, "Nothing." I guess I didn't have a better answer. They were satisfied I was not dangerous and let me free to explore the conference, but insisted that a security guard go with me to see Iwata give the keynote. Honestly, if the guard wasn't there, I might have gotten up and screamed something, but I doubt I would have had the balls. I flew back to New Jersey and went back to their apartment. I had been compromised. I regressed back into a simple consumer. Defeated, I shaved my head in submission, not realizing the meaning of the act. For a few weeks I kept going to the arcade and playing in there. Groove 2. I would get $20 of tokens, play a few games, and give the handful of tokens to some kid. It was worth it, making a memory for someone. I almost, but not quite, passed Summer Speedy Mix in the arcade. I played PSP and watched Game Center CX and some TED Talks and thought about what to do next. I had to be alone for a while, and I decided to move to Austin, Texas, which I had read was an industry hub where a lot of creative types lived. I packed up my car and took off alone, telling my friend I would go scope it out first. I drove to Austin and stayed at a hotel for a few days while I looked for an apartment complex that would take me. I found a place for $700 a month, signed the lease, and unpacked my car. A few trips to Target and IKEA later and I had covered the windows with black plastic, put together some wire shelves, and had a mattress on the floor. I drove back to New Jersey and helped my friend move to Dallas to stay with one of his former band members, a few hours north of where I was staying. We packed another U-Haul and got the rest of my stuff and my cat. I got Comcast internet access in, rented a private server at a hosting company. I wasn't sure what I was going to do with it yet, but my forum had convinced me it was a good idea. Unfortunately, the reality of single-man development is that it is slow and time-consuming. Having internet access was a mistake, and the server turned out to be mostly a waste of money, though it was a good learning experience. I spent a month working on an iPhone port, got a very basic version working, and decided to put it on hold. I hated working in Xcode on macOS, having been a lifetime Windows guy, and I had no motivation to work on a platform where I knew the controls would be terrible. I decided to target PC instead. I taught myself SDL and some basic OpenGL. I implemented some funky HQ2X filters to make things look nicer, and then removed them. I was motivated and enthusiastic, but still didn't feel like myself again. Once things calmed down again, I decided to email the producer guy at Nintendo and apologize. I didn't get any response. In fact, my email address had been blocked, so I sent it again from a different Gmail account. This was really frustrating to me, since I was ambitious and being as creative as possible, and this was a company that prided itself on its creativity, passion, and personality. After I sent the email, I felt like I lost half of my energy I had submit, even though it was something I really felt that I should have stood up for. Did I really do anything that terrible? Once again, it was something that I didn't understand at the time, but eventually came to understand why. They were still a cold hard business underneath the friendly facade, like every company must be. They had offered me a job and I had declined it. It wasn't my company to create for. If I wanted to put my personality and passion into my products, I couldn't do it on the back of a Nintendo system. It was the first time I had really been alone in a city, and I wasn't too comfortable with venturing out of my apartment. I thought it would be a good idea while I had the chance to experience a bit of it. That's why I moved there, wasn't it? I didn't know where to start, so I went to go check out a small industrial club in downtown Austin called Elysium. I had never really drank alcohol, other than drinking until I puked a few times when I was 17 or so. But I ordered a Tecate and tried to talk to some people. I eventually met a group of regulars there and we exchanged phone numbers. I released another demo, this time for the PC. I had been really motivated, enthusiastic, and amped up on coffee and Ritalin, and posted something like, "Full release." I think I had been trying to motivate myself to stay locked in and keep working, and was going to release a story about the makings of the game. I decided against it, and figured the demo was good enough. The demo was pretty good, but it was far from a full release, and I don't think people were really thrilled with it. I was really proud that I had ported my code to SDL and actually had a tangible desktop client. Unfortunately, the code was a disaster. I had essentially written a layer simulating the DS functions. All the events and scenarios and maps were hard-coded. I just wanted to start over from scratch, but I knew I didn't have time. I also wasn't going to just take the full game and put it online for free. I had to make some money. This was my career and I had invested years of my life into it. Freed from the constraints of the Nintendo hardware, I suddenly had to find a real way to sell the game. I applied for Steam. It was declined, probably by a temp worker who decided he just didn't like me. This was years before the green light system. Shortly after, I went to GDC Austin. It was smaller than the normal GDC and kind of boring. I went to the Sony booth and the guy there knew who I was. He gave me his card and told me to apply for PSP licensing, ensuring me that I would definitely be approved. I came back home and applied. They declined the application. I went to a panel where the Fez guy was giving a presentation with the World of Goo guys. They asked if I was in the room. I didn't say anything. Then they ripped on my trailer for a few minutes. I showed my badge to the guy next to me and shook my head. I wore my Bob Industrial Villain costume with the spiked goth boots I had bought in New York to a big GDC party that night. There I met my friend Alex Peak, of Code Hero fame, who came up to me and complimented the outfit. He told me I should move to the San Francisco Bay Area, Silicon Valley. I drove around Austin in my mom's convertible blasting hardcore German industrial music with Alex and Robin Arnott. I went to the goth club to try and shake the feeling of overwhelming hopelessness. I started going more regularly. I went and saw a bunch of the industrial bands I liked play. At the very least, Austin was a good place to see live music. Soon I was getting invited to after-parties where people were snorting lines of cocaine. Apparently a popular thing due to being near the water. I tried it, and decided it was the stupidest drug on the planet. It was like really expensive Ritalin that only lasted 20 minutes. I didn't even like Ritalin. I started amassing a collection of Japanese porn torrents from 4chan. I was becoming a depraved person and I didn't care. I went to a party and snorted a tiny dot of white crystal methamphetamine. It felt like I had taken a dozen Ritalins. If anything, it motivated me to get the heck out of there. I decided immediately that I needed to leave Austin. I went home, deleted all my porn, packed my car in one night, gave my desk and chair away, and went to the leasing office in the morning and turned in my keys, paying the fee for cutting the lease short. It was December 31, 2009. I drove to the Bay Area calling Alex Peak when I was nearby. It was 2010. I had $20,000 left. Alex let me stay at his house in Oakland while I looked for cheap apartments. Trying to conserve what funds I had left, I was out of Ritalin, going through withdrawal, and having an awful time focusing on anything. After a month, I finally found a cheap place for $675 a month on Craigslist. An old converted motel room in Santa Clara. It had ugly pale blue Berber carpet that smelled of hospital disinfectant. Over the next week I went to IKEA and Staples and bought a folding table and chair, and covered the walls with black plastic. I went to Fry's and picked up some cheap 1080p monitors. I got Comcast internet access again and started streaming my motel room, trying to force myself to get back into the zone and get into the code. Getting increasingly frustrated. I had no target platform or way to make money and the code was a mess. More distracted and depressed than ever, I started downloading porn again and filling some cheap terabyte hard disks from Fry's with TV shows. I bought a PS3 and played through Heavy Rain, which had just been released. It was time for GDC. Back in New Jersey I had started a thread in the Select Button forums, and a guy there named Tim Rogers had told me that he could introduce me to some people in the game industry who could help me out. He was a poster on Kotaku who wrote really long, ambitious articles, and he had a lot of contacts. I was certain he could help me get my game published. I decided to send him an email asking if he would be at GDC. Alex texted me, asking me to come to Death Guild, an industrial club in San Francisco. It was raining and I was going too fast, and my car skidded off an exit ramp, through a bunch of trees, and ended up sideways on a road. Without a scratch, I kept going. I got to the club, and my phone went off. Tim had emailed back, saying he would be at GDC and we could hang out all week. I was so depressed from the Ritalin withdrawal that I actually cried a little bit of the news. Right there in the middle of Death Guild, I had forgotten my own value. I bought an HD CRT TV from Craigslist and set it up on a wire shelf. Setting up my DDR station, it was time to get back in shape. I started getting my routine back. I started to feel pretty good. I met up with Tim at a restaurant in Oakland. We spent the week of GDC driving around San Francisco in my mom's convertible and filming things at the conference. He introduced me to a lot of people. It didn't seem to help that much, but it made me feel a lot more significant in the game industry. And surely that would help me get published. In retrospect, I should have just gone it alone. And it was a mistake to pair up with another personality. I didn't think I had the confidence, which was my own fault. After GDC I asked him if I could visit Japan, because I always wanted to visit there. I told him I would help him make a video game while I was there. We went to Denny's Inn, brainstormed some game ideas. I agreed that I would try and make a game in UDK, a simple King of the Hill game where you defended a pyramid as the world ended. I liked the theme of having aliens in the sky. Maybe I just wasn't strong enough to face the pressure of my game and I needed help. Or maybe I was looking for a way out. Maybe I was trying to give up. Or maybe I just wanted to get rid of the money I had left. Maybe I just needed a vacation. I bought a ticket with Korean Air and a suitcase from Target. 16 hours later I was in Narita Airport. It wasn't really that eventful of a trip. Tim was living in an apartment with several other people, and I spent most of the time there trying to figure out UDK. To try and uphold my end of the bargain, I bought 2 desktop computers while I was there, and we hacked together some episodes for a YouTube show spliced together from random footage of walking around Tokyo. Tim was much pushier than I was used to, and after some badgering I agreed to be the CTO of his company. Despite already having my own corporation, I assumed it would be harmless. He immediately put captions into the video proclaiming himself the CEO. I was uncomfortable with it, but didn't protest. I should have stood up for myself. It was fun taking the subway and seeing Tokyo. But the novelty wore off after a week or two. Tokyo was very closed in and depressing. If I had tons of money and lived there alone, it might have been fun for a few years. But it looked like after that all the expats just hung out together and imported a lot of stuff from home, sort of defeating the purpose. I soon got frustrated with the project. There weren't many UDK examples yet and the documentation wasn't complete. Tim kept going out jogging and I complained that he wasn't pulling his weight. I did manage to pull together a very basic playable demo. But it was clear it wasn't going to happen. No sooner than I had done that, Tim pulled in another artist, a kid from the internet named Brent, and started changing the theme of the game. It wasn't the game one wanted to make anymore, and I quit. We went to an Unreal launch event, and got invited to a party afterwards. Tim Sweeney was there, hanging out in the corner by himself. I really wish I would have talked to him. I sent him an email later saying just that and he replied, sighing thanks. I never did get to meet him. I flew back home, glad to get back to work. Tim messaged me, asking if I wanted to go to E3. He flew in. I picked him up. He had brought green and black Adidas tracksuits, sighing we should wear them. I didn't see the harm in it and I had always wanted to go to E3, so I agreed. I should have said no, especially to the tracksuits. We drove down to Los Angeles. E3 was fun but depressing. The 3DS was shown for the first time. I took a video of me putting in an R4, trying to play the villain role again and trying to look cool. In reality, I was so nervous they would catch me that I was shaking. And the card slots weren't even functional. There was a Lakers game at the same time as their conference and the crowd got angry at Tim's green tracksuit and started shaking my car, almost turning it over. I sat in the driver's seat laughing. The conference and the parties didn't really hold my interest. I just wanted to go back to how things were and work on my game. This whole thing wasn't helping at all. I had only ended up wasting a lot of time, energy, and money. We drove back up to Silicon Valley and I dropped Tim off at the airport. Glad it was finally over. A day later, I got a call. It was Tim, sighing they had refused to let him back into Japan. He had been deported to Hawaii. I started laughing. He stayed in Hawaii for a week and then flew back in. He stayed in my tiny converted motel room and we cut the E3 footage into a movie. Tim convinced me to get a gym membership. We went to 24-hour fitness and he showed me how to use the machines. This would prove to be extremely valuable later. Thanks, Tim. I was extremely depressed and frustrated with the situation, and started searching for a way out. I made a Match.com profile and met up with a Chinese lady who worked at Apple. 5 years older than me. Almost immediately, she wanted to move in together. I was desperate and was running out of money, and I agreed, thinking it would buy me some time. I wish I hadn't. I should have said no immediately. Tim moved in with his friend Brandon and I moved in with the Chinese lady, getting a small house in San Jose. After a couple of months, I started trying to work on my game again. Immediately frustrated and lost, I broke down crying. It was over. Was it my fault? It was. But it didn't feel like it should have been. I went to a local medication management psychiatrist and got a modest prescription for Adderall 5 milligrams. I went to Target and got some nicotine patches. I set the DDR station back up. I was completely lost, and DDR was the only point of light I had left. I popped some Adderall, put on a nicotine patch, and started playing. Trying to pick myself up again, Tim came and stayed in the spare room for a couple of weeks, where played through Super Mario X. I got him to play DDR. We started putting together the E3 footage into a DVD. I played DDR and thought about what would happen to technology like the Nintendo DS. I realized that phones were going to drive the prices of mobile hardware to nothing. Like what had happened to digital watches. Digital watches were $1,000 when they first came out. A decade later, they were putting them as prizes in cereal boxes. The idea for the ND started to form in my head. I had found a way out of the hole I was in, and I clung to it. I got more and more interested with the concept, and started putting together a pitch with Tim. Him goading me into calling it the Action Button Mobile Entertainment Device. He came up with a lot of really good ideas. I started working on a model using Google SketchUp. We went over my friend Alex Peake's house, where he was putting together a team, working on an educational game project called Primer, a reference to the Diamond Age by Neal Stephenson. He was talking to some pretty big VC people, and I felt threatened and got upset and jealous, thinking it was cheating. I had worked so hard and gotten nothing for it, and it felt unfair that he was going to get a video game funded without going through what I had. I panicked and sent out some nasty emails, almost totally compulsively. It was my first experience feeling so jealous that I sunk to that low. But the scariest part was that I didn't realize what I was doing was wrong. A few years later I would make this connection and understand why the world is the way it is. God's name is jealous. If you can't beat M, join M. I came back and decided if he could do it, I could do it. While we were in Silicon Valley, I might as well give the whole investment thing a try too. I had always laughed at the whole culture, assuming everyone involved was trying to get rich quick with bubbles and scam companies. But I decided to give it the benefit of doubt. I was mostly right to begin with. But not all the companies that get funded are that way. It was Thanksgiving and Tim went home to his parents. I emailed Excel Partners and got a meeting with a VC there on my first try. I drove there a few days later, and despite it being my first time in an intimidating VC office, I wasn't too nervous. I walked through a fancy hallway with glass and gold trim, up an elevator, and into a big room with all glass offices. A secretary offered me a bottle of water and I took it. My first mistake. I sat down in a conference room with a bookshelf full of books like The Art of War and Mind Games. I didn't yet understand. My presentation was atrocious. I had absolutely no idea what I was doing. I had only some notes, some papercraft mock-ups, and my game running on the DS. The guy had done some research on me before I got there, and asked to see my game running. I booted it up and slid him the DS. He didn't touch it once. He asked me a few questions. Then, after I had awkwardly tried to read from my notes, he looked at his watch and said he had to go. I came home feeling defeated and frustrated. I had been totally owned in about 30 seconds. I played some DDR and got my heart rate up, then sent the investor a snarky email in frustration. I felt like he had trapped my confidence somehow, but I didn't understand how. We're psychic beings. The investors are, in a way, slave masters. The only response was to keep trying. I sent the pitch to the old Nintendo email chain from the viral ad on a whim, knowing they wouldn't take anything I said seriously, but that it was a good idea and I was probably the first to think of it. Maybe I would impress some people there. Maybe I would even freak them out a little. I felt more dejected than ever. Tim came back from his parents and we shipped out the DVDs. I felt that I had done most of the work and I was getting really frustrated. I felt trapped, weak, and helpless. GDC had come up and I didn't even want to go. Tim got us passes, and even got us into the Nintendo keynote. He had to persuade me to stay. I didn't want to be there. Satoru Iwata got on stage and talked about making the impossible possible, which was eerily similar to something I had said in my trailer video. He then said, "Believe in yourself." Tim leaned over and said, "He's talking to you, Bob." He probably was. For some reason, I got very angry, especially at something Iwata had said. Engineers don't matter, which was a point of argument I had made in my insane chain letter emails. Now I believe that Iwata was correct, and that he is a brilliant CEO. I just didn't have enough experience to understand the meaning of what he was saying. I had been so crushed that the slightest hint of an opening was enough. I rushed back home and made a horrible screamo industrial trailer, yelling about a $10 console. I didn't make sense, but I didn't care. I was just trying to plant the seed and nail the concept home onto the internet that handhelds would soon be cheap. I threw in some accusations of unfair treatment to Western developers, "You can even be American," and cackled like a maniac. I was up all night making the music and was totally loopy. I felt like it was my final attack and I was going to go out with a blaze of glory, with a war cry that would resonate through the heavens. I suppose it was intended to be both outrageous and intimidating. But that was also the type of music I had been listening to. That was certainly a mistake. I never really intended to make the thing. I actually was hoping that I could get someone to steal the idea. But mostly I was hoping it would freak out Nintendo a bit. I am pretty sure it worked. Tim went to go work with Alex on his Primer project, part of which had become Code Hero. It was my last hurrah and I had gone out in a blaze of glory. For the next month or two I refreshed 4chan, masturbated to porn, and played Call of Duty. I bought a bunch of sex toys and just sunk deeper and deeper into my addictions. It was over. I was a worthless piece of shit and the world had ruined my dreams despite how hard I had tried. And I had every right to be bitter and selfish. I felt my will completely slip away. The days becoming a blur, I downloaded increasingly sick porn, and went into the bathroom to stare at myself in the mirror. Standing there was a monster, a person who was better off dead. At that moment, I decided that I was going to seriously try to make the ND myself. It was worth a shot, why not? I had made probably the largest independent game by one person at 23 years old. Why couldn't I pull this off? I went back to the medication management psychiatrist and got a decently strong Ritalin prescription. I started smoking again. I spent the next few weeks making the website. It was my first experience with PHP and it was a good learning experience. I made a single sign-on system for the wiki, forums, and developer accounts and had a system for developers to upload screenshots of their games, which automatically created a wiki entry and a forum post. I persuaded Tim to talk to some of his contacts and somehow he put me in touch with the founder of a major Chinese trading company and their former CEO of a major toy company. We started having Skype meetings every day. I must have sounded convincing enough because they seemed to be on board. I put together a very rudimentary SDK based on the GP32 SDK. Just a simple code block side and SDL distribution. I assumed that even if the project didn't work out, it would get some people started in the right direction, and they could always release for PC. I started working on a prototype, taking apart a GP32 and hacking the Linux firmware with a custom loader I had written in SDL. I actually got the PC version of my game ported and mostly functional within a few days, planning to 3D print a custom shell for the Wiz through a 3D printing service called Shapeways. Tim and I went over Alex's friend's Jay and Splarker's new apartment up in Fremont and Jay offered to remake the 3D model in Blender. I started talking to the Dingo people, a Chinese company that made a cheap handheld. I mostly bullshitted my way through the emails, telling them I would get a big investment and order 1 million units. I knew they were making the devices for much less than the selling price, and I got them to agree to a $25 price point. It wasn't exactly $10, but close enough. Given time, the price would drop down that far. The idea was sound, sort of. The retail viability wasn't proven at all, but I didn't consider it. I was all in. As soon as I opened the site, the wiki got vandalized by trolls, replacing the download page for the SDK with insults. I quickly locked the wiki, defeating the whole purpose. I hadn't yet realized exactly what the gaming community was. With tons of confidence, I emailed John Carmack and he replied. We had a short discussion about OnLive. I searched on Google for venture capital Silicon Valley and opened the first few links, making a chain email with all the email addresses I could find. At this point, I just didn't care. I had the CEO of a toy company, a bunch of developers, an SDK, a working prototype running my game, and a manufacturer willing to make units close to my price point. I sent the site and the full pitch email to all of them in the most confident email I could muster. I didn't get in any replies. I argued with some people on the forums and got pulled in some drama. I sent more emails to the investors with much less confidence. I had put myself way out there, but the gamble hadn't paid off. I posted the prototype video and emailed investors again. Still nothing. Nintendo released the 3DS. Knowing I couldn't win, I became bitter again, making cruel posts on the forum, banning some users that annoyed me. I had become what I hated. Tim went to go work for a small gaming company. The lady I was living with moved into an apartment. I was completely broke, alone in a house in San Jose with an old MacBook on the floor, with nowhere to go. I had spent the money in 3 years, having spent about $28,000 a year after the loss from the stock market. Not terribly frugal, but not bad compared to most people with regular jobs. Phil flew in from Michigan for a conference, and stayed at the house for a couple of days. Since I had last seen him, Phil had created an advertising company called Pocket Sense. He had become a real professional. He had created a local empire back in Michigan, serving 1 billion ads and becoming one of the most important companies in the Detroit tech startup scene. I was looking at technologies in order to make an online world which would connect to their ND. I told him about my idea, and we researched what technology would be good for it. I had been hacking on his editor for years and had picked up Java fairly well. It seemed to be a good language choice. Since Android used it, it could work in the browser, albeit with an ugly security warning. I played the Java port of Quake 2 in the browser and I was impressed. It was just as good as native, if only there was a way to get rid of that ugly warning. The guys that Alex had been living with, Jay and Sparker, had gotten an apartment and offered to let me stay in the spare bedroom. Phil helped me move my stuff there, and we lugged a heavy HD CRT up the stairs. Thanks Phil. Rage came out and I bought it, the only PC game one had bought in years. I played it for 19 hours in one sitting and thought it was fantastic. I called everyone over and wowed at the graphics, staring at the rocks for hours. People online were digging at an ATI driver issue. I had the issue, and some textures were flickery until I downloaded a patch. It obviously wasn't the game's fault. The game was awesome. I played along with the zeitgeist and tweeted a snarky comment about it being done when it's done, a reference to a quote on John Carmack's blog somewhere. It got retweeted. The game didn't do that well. It should have. Somewhere, deep down, I felt that I had kicked a hero of mine in the balls. The guy had replied to me twice, and I was just so frustrated I couldn't return anything but bile. I deleted all my tweets, suddenly embarrassed at how negative and bratty they were. This wasn't me. This wasn't the person who wrote a game from the heart. I decided to start working on a Java remake of my game, intended to be a Facebook-connected massively multiplayer, hub world, hangout type place, called ND World, sort of like Habbo Hotel or Disney's Club Penguin, but with connectivity to the ND, where your player would upload through the ND to the PC and the ND would act as a controller. It was a neat idea. Jay and Splaka went home for Christmas. I sat alone in the spare bedroom and started a new project in Eclipse. It was 2012. I was 28 years old. Alex ran his Kickstarter and got $170,000 to make Code Hero. I was a little envious, but I was really glad he finally got something to work out, because he had struggled for so long, and I certainly hadn't helped by flipping out on him, having just burned through all of my own money. My only solid advice was to invest in a good 30-inch 2560 by 1600 monitor and be frugal about everything else. And I think he listened. Alex is an incredibly hard worker and one of the most talented guys I've met. For as long as I knew him, he would pass out sitting in his chair with his laptop about to slide off onto the floor, only to wake up and start coding again. Somehow a few of his Kickstarter backers would end up turning on him, but the truth was that he had gone above and beyond. But that's his story to tell. I stocked up on modafinil, ordering several boxes of it from an Indian online pharmacy. I went to my medication management psychiatrist and asked to double my Ritalin prescription, saving up as much as I could. I ordered a bunch of cigarette filter tubes and rolling tobacco. The next 10 months were a complete blur. We put a heat lamp in a storage closet and made a cat door for it, letting my cat lie out on the balcony. I visited her once or twice an hour to smoke a cigarette. The rest of the time I spent in a trance in the spare room, humming the music on a loop and coding like a maniac, amped up on Ritalin or modafinil, alternating between them every week to try and prevent tolerance. I took a ton of supplements, various nootropics, anything that would give me an edge: pyracetam, ALCAR, L-tyrosine, theanine, ALA, ashwagandha, lion's mane, etc. Don't take them all at once. They are not all compatible. Do your research. Better yet, don't do them at all. I masturbated to Japanese H-games and JAVs several times a day, just to get the dopamine rush so I could code for another couple hours. I got back into 9-inch nails for the first time in half a decade, and realized his newer stuff was really good. My roommate Splaka pounded on the locked door to get me to stop my terrible off-key singing. Within a month I had added lighting support into my tools and added lights throughout their whole game. I improved the graphics overall, going through and cleaning tons of stuff up. I added more characters. Within a few months I had a functional rewrite, loading the maps and moving the character around. With Jay's advice on the architecture, he was a network DevOps guy. I designed a server and had the game load compressed graphics over the network and build textures from the data. It was neat, if not unnecessarily complex. I was staring through my to-do list and didn't consider anything else. In retrospect, I was probably the worst roommate possible. It's a miracle they didn't kick me out. Maybe they were afraid to. Maybe I was like Hitler. After 8 months, Jay and Splaka decided to move into a new place up near San Francisco in a couple months. Maybe as a polite way to get rid of me without kicking me out. I had nowhere to go and no money, but I had to find a new place soon. I was in no way prepared for this, even with a 2-month notice. I was completely burnt out and had been destroying my mind in extreme desperate crunch mode for a year. I had absolutely no willpower. I went to go stay with Tim for a few days, and he set up a meeting between me and a guy who had just sold his company for $100 million. I hastily got my game working on a MacBook and we took off to meet the guy in a coffee shop. The meeting actually went pretty well. The guy wanted me to make a tablet version, which I was planning to do, but wasn't a priority. Other than that, he wasn't ready to invest in anything, and I really didn't want investment, I just wanted funding. And I didn't have a company or even know how to handle dividing ownership. For some reason, Tim had his friend Brandon come over. They sat me down and had me watch Conan the Barbarian, 1982. Did you know you were a slave? I didn't quite understand yet. Regardless, I was desperate. I came back from Tim's and spent 2 weeks in an insane non-stop crunch mode, making a sleazy adult hookup website with anonymous avatars. I hoped it would generate ad revenue. Once the site was up and running, I posted it on 4chan and got 700 sign-ups in 2 days, proving that the idea was at least pretty solid. With the site finished, I started searching for ads, only to find that adult-friendly ad banners were hopelessly worthless because they were mostly used on porn sites. I shut the site, sort of glad that I wouldn't end up as the Mark Zuckerberg of sex. My roommates moved out, and I was alone in their empty apartment for 2 weeks. I had been scouring Craigslist to find a new apartment that was anywhere close to reasonable. I decided to move up to Sacramento, a few hours north, where it was much cheaper. I ended up on the outskirts of Sacramento in a filthy extended-stay motel, with all my possessions in cardboard boxes on the floor of the tiny motel room. There were ants everywhere. There was no insulation between the door and the freeway directly outside of it, and there was a constant breeze coming in. There were meth addicts in the hallway when I came in, sores on their faces, eyeing everything I was bringing into the room, despite my best efforts to conceal it. Someone asked me a question about those computers you got there. There was a screaming couple in the room next to mine for a few nights until the police came and pounded on the door. Then it was quiet. I was there for almost a month. I was terrified and confused, and completely unable to focus. I ate pasta, cooked on the tiny stove in the corner. I sat on the bedspread and made a stack of boxes to put my 2006 MacBook on, and kept scanning Craigslist for apartments, feeling completely helpless. I had none of the requirements to get a place. Sitting on the stained bedspread, I thought about how it had come to this. I realized what a disaster I had become. My mind was completely tanked and I was completely terrified. Suddenly, I made some connections. The tracksuits, the embarrassing videos, the porn in Japan, Conan the Barbarian, the hard drive of anime I had given Brandon, the computers I had bought in Tokyo. Did you know you were a slave? It was mind control. I had been brainwashed. I didn't know what it meant to be free, but I sure didn't like that I was a slave. I flipped out on Tim, realizing we were competitors and feeling that he had taken advantage of me, sending him non-stop texts railing on him for 2 or 3 days straight. I kept flipping out, emailing his friends, warning them. I drove back to Oakland and took the computer I had given him back, leaving him the hard disk. I was the losing dog. Later I realized that I wasn't being honest with myself. I wasn't innocent. I had taken advantage of him in a way too, since I had wanted to see Tokyo, but I couldn't see that. I was just too stressed, too spoiled, and my ego was too big. I believed that I deserved better than this and needed someone to blame. The most important lesson learned was that I had done most of these things to myself. I had let him do it to me. I am an exit. Even more important was the later realization that everything is mind control. We do it naturally. It is an instinct. Tim wasn't doing it on purpose. He was doing it because I was letting him. Tim actually had helped me a whole lot more than he hurt, yet I couldn't see that at the time. Tim is a genius and an incredibly strong and creative person with great integrity. And I am glad to be his friend. He is somehow still willing to deal with me. He is currently working on a fantastic game called Videoball, which will most certainly be a huge success. Oh. It's completely true, but I didn't know that yet. I kept flipping out on him, and finally, having gained enough leverage to muster a last bit of willpower, I Skyped with my parents and asked him for enough to get a place. My former roommate drove up and co-signed the lease. I moved all my stuff and, exhausted and shaky, the nightmare was over, for now. I set up my desk, covered the walls in black plastic, got city fiber internet access. I put a futon mattress on the floor next to my desk in the large hardwood floor room, and set up a DDR station in the small room. I went to a bulk food store and filled the cupboards with cans of coffee, hazelnut syrup, mixed vegetables, tomatoes, and garbanzo beans. I made a giant batch of the vegetable mixture and filled the freezer with Ziploc containers full of the stuff. I went to a local tobacco store and got cans of rolling tobacco and filter tubes. The owner, a guy with a snake tattoo on his arm, smirked at me and held up a cheap complimentary lighter and sparked it, as if to mesmerize me with the flame. I came back and ran into my next-door neighbor in the hallway, a lady a few years older than me. I hung out with her for a few days and had some good conversations. She slept over the next night. But the next day I knew that I had to get to work. I snapped my prepaid SIM card in half to avoid texting her. And then when I told her, she slammed the door on me. At that, I completely lost control. It was just like with the girl from high school, in 2007. I lost my mind. I paced around in my apartment, walking in circles for nearly a week, yelling nonsense at the wall, putting up signs to myself, chain smoking. I hooked up my microphone and screamed along with my music for days. Finally, I realized that giving in to temptation had worn down my will. I didn't quite understand it fully yet, but I knew what I had to do. I deleted all my porn and decided to clean myself up again. I played DDR for an hour a day and bought a pull-up bar. I weaned myself off the last of my Ritalin within a month. I still drank way too much coffee, smoked cigarettes and occasionally a tiny puff of weed, and took modafinil, but I didn't have any more time to waste. I sealed the door with tape, boarded it up with a few scraps of wood I had, just to make it more difficult for myself to open it, and got to work. The important thing was that I began to understand. We are in a giant meat grinder tournament of willpower. Everything around you is mind control. Those who fail lose their soul and become slaves. Politics is an industry based on mind control. Television is textbook brainwashing. Friendship and marriage is often codependence. Parents control their children. Boys make video games and start metal bands to control their girlfriends. We are psychic beings. The word government means control mind, but more on that later.